Are a disaster.
All right, this is Jason Wilcox coming back again. We got John Conroy coming on in a couple of seconds here, laying down another speech on legalization. I mean, he works for many groups, so we're going to listen to what he has to say. Again, medical and legalization, whatever else he's going to bring up, but it's definitely going to be interesting. You know, it's a cannabis crusader himself. Let's see what he has to say.
Conroy to the stage. He's going to speak with us. Thank you.
Thank you. I see it's already 10 to 3, and but they told me that I could talk for as long as I wanted. So I warned them that that was a dangerous thing to do. Talk to a lawyer and let him talk for as long as he wants. But I'll try not to put you to sleep. Joy Davies, the previous speaker, referred you to Zoomer magazine. And there's a couple of other good things in that edition that she referred to. For those of you who don't know what Zoomer magazine is, it's us older folks getting together to try and revive what we did in the 60s. And it's got some good cartoons in it, as well as Moses's statement supporting the cause. There's a couple of cats sitting having coffee, and the one says to the other, "I use catnip too, but only for medical purposes." And then another one of two cows out in the grass, and one says to the other, "Dynamite grass." But my favorite is the one where there's two guys sitting in a bar, and one says, "Medical marijuana, sure, but just try to get a prescription for beer." So my point is, if none of you have watched Ken Burns' documentary on prohibition, I recommend it to you, because you then understand that all that this is really about is two different legal approaches to a particular issue. One is prohibition, and the other is regulation, or legalization, as it's popularly called. Under prohibition, you drive things into a black market, the prices go up, people can't go to the police when they get ripped off, they can't go to lawyers, they can't go to the courts, they don't have peaceful ways to resolve their disputes, and so they resort to violence. It's a very, very simple thing. That's what happens if there's a demand for something and governments use the policy of prohibition as their approach. If you regulate and tax, very simple policy, you then bring the issue under control instead of leaving it out of control. You certainly may not like various regulations and so on, but it's better to have a regulatory model where it's under control, where standards are set, and where people can engage in peaceful remedies to resolve any disputes. That's what having a country that's governed by the rule of law is all about, you know, so that not only do we have laws that govern ourselves that are reasonable and that we know what they are beforehand, but also that we have ways to resolve our disputes and to resolve them in a peaceful manner. I'll leave aside the whole issue of how costly it is at this point for another debate about lawyers or the legal system. But in terms of this issue, in terms of cannabis, and from my perspective, all drugs, a prohibitionist policy that says thou shalt not consume a particular drug is pure folly and destined to fail. And we've now had, certainly, I've been practicing law now for 40 years, and I've been involved in this issue for that length of time. And I've seen various governments over the years come up to the brink and make promises about what they were going to do once they got into power, even on this issue. And unfortunately, they've always been too busy or had too many other priorities once they got into power. But right now, we are at a very important point in time, I think, in our history. While we've had all these other things happen over the years, we now have Colorado and Washington State legalizing marijuana. Now you have to understand, in the states, criminal law is state controlled, not federal, although their drug laws are federal through an interstate commerce, but we'll get into the complicated constitutional parts of that. And so, in fact, in the US, they've had some 13 states for many, many years who've treated possession much like a traffic ticket. But now we have 2 states that have specifically legalized, and it's had a very interesting effect. I'm on a listserv of about 500 lawyers in the US, and you can see that people are now getting return phone calls from congressmen. People are now beginning to listen and are paying way more attention than they ever have before. So I think it's an important point. I've, as I say, been around and come up to the brink many times, and so I still have a healthy dose of skepticism about anything to do with politicians, but I think that these are factors that seem to be leading a bit of a domino thing. So we have to look at it and remember that in Canada, criminal law is federal. It covers the whole country. It's not state by state. But health, and to clarify a point from the previous speaker, health is not defined in the division of powers between the feds and the provinces in Canada. Both have jurisdiction. The feds, as you know, have the Canada Health Plan, and so on major things that affect the country as a whole, that's where they claim their health power. Whereas the licensing of doctors, pharmacists, doctors, hospitals, these sorts of things, it's all provincial. And so there's this division, and that's why this issue that Joy was talking about a bit earlier, it's very important to develop something on the provincial level that deals with the whole issue of how does the patient get the medicine, and how is that regulated and controlled, and it should be done through the provincial model. So that was, I think, the issue from the previous point. So we're in this situation. We have, for the first time, Justin Trudeau of the Liberal Party of Canada. I'm not a member of any of the political parties, although, as I said to somebody, I might have been signed up for the Marijuana Party years ago and forgot to undo my membership or something. But the Liberal Party of Canada, his father, Pierre Trudeau, was a big thing in my day. Many of us baby boomers are hoping that his son will come along and do the same thing, and particularly on this issue, because it is really the first time that I can recall that a politician has stood up and said that they will legalize. It's always been this decriminalize, or some sort of move it into the Contraventions Act, or some sort of thing where you would still be subject to having your liberty interfered with by agents of the state. So this time, it's very interesting, and they've also put out a big book that really has thought about it in a lot of detail. I don't like what they say about hard drugs, but that's another issue. I think if they don't understand how that too is stupidity, they should just leave it alone and not talk about it. But on their marijuana, what I understand is not yet official policy, but it's been passed by a group of the Liberal Party and is working its way up into becoming policy. And you have the likely leader of that party going to saying that that's what they will do. The NDP seem to be going backwards and calling for another study, which, on this topic, boy, we've been studied to death. All we need is a study on how not to have another study when it comes to cannabis. So there's the strategy that's developing, and it's starting out in BC, is we have Sensible BC, Dana Larson. It's essentially a follow-up on all the efforts to try and make sure that the possession of cannabis is treated as the lowest police priority, that they don't enforce the law, or enforce it only as little as possible, and only in egregious circumstances if that could exist. And so you're defanging prohibition. You're taking away the enforcement arm. You have to remember that while criminal law is the power of the feds, the administration of justice is provincial. So once again, if you can get the provincial governments to not enforce and get your local municipal people who control the police spending and so on to not make that a priority, make it the lowest priority. These are all very important efforts that have to take place in order to get this thing to legalization. That's where we've got to go, and that has to be the priority. I'm afraid I disagree with Joy when she says she's not putting an ounce of her time into legalization until the medical issue is solved. I can completely empathize with her and understand where she's coming from, especially when you're a patient and involved in that sort of situation. But if we legalize, then many of the problems that we have in terms of the whole issue of medical and regulation of medical will go away. You have to remember, cannabis currently remains under a schedule to the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. If it wasn't in the schedule, it would clearly fall under a natural health care product. And many of the proposed new regulations and so on are being drawn from those sources. And so if you take it out of the schedule to the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, we're into a whole new ballgame in terms of the proper, reasonable regulation of the product, whether it be for medical or for recreational. So what we need to see is a sustained effort, not just from individuals, and you know, we have to do this national campaign. Normal Canada, you have the booth right behind me, is reviving itself and putting itself together again. We need to get people to join, to raise money in order to have that national voice to keep communicating with the Harper government about this issue. But we also have to get behind sensible, one little thing before I finish that. There's not just Normal Canada as a whole, but there's another important group to the left, the Women's Alliance of Normal Canada. Now this is important too. If you, again, I mentioned Ken Burns' documentary on prohibition. You know, many of us grow up thinking, well, it was the women's Christian temperance movement that was responsible for prohibition of alcohol, and that we really have to fear that. And there may be a bit of truth to that, but the real important thing is that it was the women's groups who got rid of prohibition. They were the ones advocating on behalf of women and children, and they were the ones who were the most successful in getting the politicians to listen and to turn the corner. So you need to get out and support the Women's Alliance to speak on behalf of women and children, because politicians, you'll find, will often listen much more carefully to them than they'll listen to somebody like me. So you have to do the national thing, but also do the provincial thing. Get behind, in BC, Sensible BC, start thinking about having the same thing happen in each of your provinces. There's a referendum process in BC which may not exist in the other provinces, but you don't really need a referendum. If you can get your provincial politicians on side, that's what you need to do. And let's try and do what they're doing in the states. While they're going state by state, we should be going province by province, while at the same time taking that federal position in order to say, the time has come to legalize it. Let's get it done this time. No more false promises. May 2015 is the election. Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party of Canada are the people who say they will do it. If they're the ones who say that will do it, well then we should support them, because that's what we want. Now, in order to do that, we got to raise money. It's always the problem. And we've got all sorts of people we can see here that have developed certain niches in the industry. And it is an industry. It's a big industry. And so we need not only individuals stepping up to the plate, but we need people from the industry to come together. I was listening to some people from Denver, Colorado yesterday, explaining how that developed slowly over time between the various people who are either running medicinal clinics, but also the people who are producing various types of hardware or whatever in order to help support the people in the medicinal business or even in the recreational business. So we all need to come together and somehow start raising significant amounts of money not simply for the court cases, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, but to do legalization. We should really have somebody in Ottawa in an office that maybe shares the office with the Women's Alliance and Normal Canada and other groups who are there for having a presence in Ottawa on a daily basis to communicate with federal politicians and federal bureaucrats. And as I say, we need to do that provincially too, so we need to get behind campaigns like Sensible BC. Bob Erb, you've probably heard of, was a man who won 25 million in the lotto, and he has made a strong commitment. And thanks to Bob, we've had some very big 420 rallies this year that seem to have gone very well. He's supporting the marches, and he's a guy with a golden heart who really is keen on seeing a change. But we can't just rely on Bob. We need to get some of the other folks, especially those who've got a commitment and who have funds, to get together, contribute to Normal, contribute to the Women's Alliance, contribute to any groups that have got that focus, whether it's on the federal focus or the provincial. So that's my rant on where we should be going in 2014 and 2015 in this country. I make money out of prohibition. The more things they prohibit, the more trials that I do. You know, the Harper government has given you mandatory minimums. So now, if you grow more than 6 marijuana plants, you can expect to go to jail for 6 months. And the judge has no say in the matter. So you've got people who grow anywhere between 6 and 500 plants. If you grow 500 plants, the mandatory minimum is 2 years, 1 day into the federal system. Now, I can tell you, having practiced for 40 years and having a part of my practice is post-sentencing involving prisons. Provincial prisons where you do time up to 2 less a day are not very pleasant places. And even on a 6-month sentence, you're going to do 4 months because there won't be any time for you to have any paperwork done to see the parole board or whatever. You'll earn 2 months off for good behavior and you'll do 4 months. And that's all graduated up all the way up to the ones that get 2 years. You know, parole eligibility is at 1/3. And if you're not an undue risk to reoffend, you may do the rest of it on parole. And so my point really is that unless you're part of organized crime, unless you're being paid to do that time, you don't want to go there. But on the other hand, if you are part of organized crime, then, you know, what's paying somebody to do 4 months or 6 months or 8 months and get parole? So, you know, the impact of mandatory minimums, again, it pushes the price up further, it makes the product even more valuable, and it increases the violence in the industry, which doesn't have to exist. It's only violent because they don't have access to peaceful remedies like anybody else in any other industry. So that's the other aspect. So you've got to get out and vote. You may not have any faith in politicians at all, but you've got to get out and vote. And you've got to vote against Harper, if nothing else. Because there should be, what? No prison for pot, right? Should there be prison for pot? No. All right. And he says prison for pot. So, you know, vote against Harper, vote against the Conservatives, and at the moment, and I don't see any change, vote for the Liberal Party of Canada. And let's get legalization finally happening in this country. So, a little bit about the medical end of things. Better check to see how I'm doing time-wise. Oh, not too bad. Medical. The government, as you know, for about the last 13 years, we've had the medical marijuana access regulations. They are regulations pursuant to the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, so they're an exception to the general criminal law. They came about as a result of court cases. The Parker case here in Ontario was the leading case. Most recently, we've had the decision of the Ontario Court of Appeal in Murnaugh. And these two, or these cases and a number of them in between, with the last one making it quite clear that in Canada, if your doctor approves you and says that cannabis is reasonable for whatever medical condition that you have, then you have a constitutional right of reasonable access. That's the law. And so, under the medical marijuana access regulations, people have had the ability to get licenses to produce for themselves. So you get an authorization to possess, we call it an ATP. You get a license, a personal production license, a PPL, to grow for yourself. How much you can grow, how much you can store, all these sorts of things are dependent upon discussions between you and your doctor in terms of your grams per day dosage. Still a lot of learning and education to be done in that regard in relation to many doctors in particular. So you've got that under the MMAR, and you could also have a designated grower, somebody grow for you. And so we challenged those laws in the early days, saying that because you could only grow for one patient, saying they were too restrictive. The courts agreed, and the government said, okay, you can grow for two. We challenged the restriction on only having 3 licenses in one place as being too restrictive, and the courts agreed, and the government said, okay, you can have 4. And so, I mean, the whole objective was to get them to recognize that compassion clubs and dispensaries are a very logical, reasonable, rational way to deliver cannabis to patients. And you can see what the government's reaction was. Myrna, the challenge was to the fact that the doctors are boycotting the whole program. And they were very successful at the trial level on that issue, but for a different reason, the appeal was overturned. That I'm sure we'll hear more in that regard in the future. So the MMAR requires you to not only get that approval from your doctor and fill out all these forms and then send it to Ottawa, and then Health Canada approves, and it's been, you know, good and bad. There have been some long delays for a few years and all sorts of things. I've got cases going on where people have consented to the use of their property for a legal grow, and the patient or the grower has said, oh yes, the license is in, and they didn't bother to check to see it yet, and they went ahead and they've ended up being busted, even though the license came in a month later to show that it was, and they, you know, they'd applied in March and the license didn't come to the following December. And so they're having to go through a court case because of this whole process, even though all that they were doing was saying, okay, we'll give you permission to do it in our place. It was a legitimate patient and legitimate grower, but the license hadn't come in yet. I've had cases recently of warrants that have been executed on premises for all plants in excess of 195 that are permitted to be used by X. And so obviously the informations to obtain these warrants are sealed at the moment, so I haven't seen the detail, but it's obvious that there's an informant who has said that this person has more than what they're supposed to have. The problem is they went to the wrong place and ripped down the wrong place. The right place was next door, and but they also are being very malicious, turning on water so that the places flood, breaking everything. It just doesn't make any sense to me. They're going to get sued. They're going to have to pay ultimately for their stupidity, is all it is, or their, you know, excessive zeal that I don't understand, where some people still have such hatred, I think is the word to use, in relation to this plant and this product. I'm continually amazed by the attitude of some neighbors in court cases that even in relation to medical grows come to court and stare and, you know, make signs and swear at clients who really are not hardened criminals by any stretch of the imagination. But anyway, so they're proposing, under at least the first version of the medical marijuana access, or medical marijuana for medical purposes regulations, is the MMPR, were supposed to come in at the end of last March 31st of this year. And they didn't. In those regulations, it set out when they would stop having new applications under the current regulations and when the current regulations would be repealed, which was next March. So you're going to have these two sets of regulations run parallel together with some transitional provisions between them about seeds and plants and so on, with ultimately, though, only having licensed producers in the MMPR and repealing the personal production and the designated growers. Now, when you look at the overall proposed new regulations, and again, we anticipate there's going to be some changes and maybe some further delays in terms of these various dates because of timelines in order to try and do it. I think Health Canada's current position still is March of next year, but the longer it is before we see the actual final set, I suspect the longer it'll be. But if you look at them overall, they're not bad. They're actually a step in the right direction. To have, in my opinion, licensed producers of cannabis across the country, meeting various regulatory requirements, particularly if they're producing medicine for people, there's going to be pretty strict regulation. You know, eventually we want licensed producers for the recreational market, don't we? So, licensed producers is a good thing. It will enable people to become licensed producers. There's no cap on the number of licensed producers. The market's going to determine that. The only problem is how much it's going to cost right now to become a licensed producer. And some of the other hurdles that are in those proposed regulations that I anticipate will still be in the new ones. A big one is security clearance. Now, many of you probably think that, oh, well, as long as I don't have a criminal record or don't have a conviction for a designated drug offense or criminal code offense within the last 10 years, which was the test for a DG, a designated grower under the MMAR, that's fine. Unfortunately not. These security clearances are way broader, and they involve them examining every police database that exists to see if your name appears in any of those databases. And believe me, with the advent of the computer, we now have a widespread proliferation of databases. And what appears in those databases is prejudicial to people. People are prejudiced by it on a regular basis. And so there's a need to control this stuff. If you need to get a criminal record check nowadays, if you go to the RCMP and you've had a stay of proceedings, which you, as a citizen, think, oh, well, the charges were dropped, the Crown decided not to proceed, forget it. The check may or may not have a record, and your employer or whoever it is that you're trying to get work with or whatever will say, what's this all about? Oh, well, I happen to be in a car with a friend of mine who was smoking a joint or had possession of a small amount of cannabis, and you know, they arrested me too. You know, something like that, and yet, and you were charged, the Crown looks at it and stays the proceedings. But you're prejudiced because you now have on your criminal record a stay of proceedings. In Ontario, they're more used to withdrawing the proceedings. But in BC, there's all sorts of technical reasons for this, that in terms of how it's easier for the Crown and so on. But you know, these things happen on a daily basis in our courts, and they do end up prejudicing people in the future. And marijuana cases are often one of them that often occur. So I got distracted there by that whole issue to do with the consequences of the record. But security clearances are extremely broad, and so people are going to have to be squeaky clean in order to get these types of licenses. How they will treat people who've had prior licenses, in my information, I'm told that Prairie Plant Systems, for example, that's the government, that was forced to become the government producer, that they also had all kinds of good seeds and are ready to market them. They'll be the first licensed producer. They've done all the R&D. And we'll get some good strains finally produced by them, because the government prevented them from doing that before. They forced them basically to only market the crap that they were grinding and so on. So anyway, but there's also, you have to have a quality assurance person. So somebody who comes around every quarter, I think it was, and weighs how much cannabidiol and THC and so on you have in your plants and weighs your seeds and a whole bunch of things like that. A whole bunch of good production practices. I've gone through these regs several times and I've tried to can them down into language that we can understand, but I hesitate to put it out publicly until we know what the final edition is. But there's a huge amount of detail, and especially right down into, you know, what bricks and mortar in your grows and so on. So it's very, very complicated in many respects and therefore likely to be very costly. But it would be far less costly and far less of a problem if we legalize first, because a whole pile of these things are only due to the fact that it's illegal. All this huge amount of security and so on that you have to have, it's because it's illegal. It's because it remains under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, and you're an exception to it. So that's the problem. So I come back to, you know, legalization is where we have to go. That's the first focus. That's what we have to stand up and demand, that our politicians, you know, get this done this time in May of 2015, and not just make all sorts of promises to us and then not carry them through once they get elected. So we have to not only get all of your friends and people out there to vote, and vote, as I say, for the Liberal Party of Canada and against the Conservative Party of Canada, to make sure that within a short time after they're elected, they pass a law that takes cannabis out of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act completely and tosses the ball to the provinces, just like tobacco, alcohol, things of that kind. You know, we already have existing models, and we fortunately have Washington State and Colorado working to try and perfect their models down there, which will always be of great help and benefit to us to see just how they figure it out. But that's what we got to do, folks. I don't know what else to say. I could go on, as you know, for hours about the detail of these regulations. The better thing, I think, is to open up to you and try to answer any specific concerns that any of you have.
You were talking about how hard it is to become a producer because of the cost.
Yeah.
My question is, would it be easier for producers, small producers now that grow for themselves or somebody else, to get together and become a co-op?
Yeah, no, there's so many things to talk about on this whole topic. I've neglected to mention a specific part that fits into what you're saying. First, we have the Coalition Against Repeal, which is an attempt to get everybody together who is a patient to bring a court case to try and preserve or grandfather a personal production license, and if possible, the genuine designated caregiver, somebody who stands in the shoes of the patient. And because the government's own proposal says that the cost is going to be $8 to $10 a gram, which, as we all know, is a Compassion Club dispensary black market type price. People who originally started growing for themselves figured out it was before they started growing for themselves, it was costing them $1,000 a month for their medicine, figured out, invested in plant and equipment and so on, and get it down to, I'm told, $1 to $4 a gram. So while the rich will be able to afford the prices under the new proposal, the poor will not. And there's no pharmacare. There's none of that, and that's another important part of looking at the provincial thing, because if we can get the province to come on board, then they are the ones who control that whole pharmacare sort of situation. So it's another good reason to get them involved. So the coalition hopes, once we know what all the dates are actually going to be, then we can move to try and prevent the repeal only of those parts of the MMAR, because we don't care about the rest of it, particularly the personal production license. And we're not asking the government to spend money. We're not asking them to have to incur a huge debt in order to enable this to go forward, because it's the individuals who have already spent that money and are doing it. And so we say if they fail to grandfather PPLs, then surely all of these people have suffered damages. They've relied upon the position of the government over the last 11, 13 years and invested this money, and they're going to suddenly take it away, and you're going to have to buy it from licensed producers at a much greater cost. So there's going to be a whole problem. So now your question, though, was about getting people together in a co-op. And I think, yes, if you look at the model in what were the proposed regulations, a co-op would be one way for people to try and share the cost by, you have a quality assurance person that goes around to all of the sites. Now, obviously practical things come into play in terms of geographical area and so on. But if you have one person who's the good production practice person and one person who's the good quality assurance person and so on, you could have multiple sites. The only drawback to that is the security that you have to have at each site, but there's some pretty sophisticated security systems that you can get nowadays. I've heard of people who've been putting big production facilities or planned production facilities together and bringing in security people to review them, these sorts of things. So, people should be, if they're planning to want to become a licensed producer, they should be looking at that sort of thing, but also looking, I think, at the co-op model as a pretty good way to try and fit into what they were proposing, but hoping again that there'll be less regulation than they've currently proposed.
I was just wondering as to what experience you might have with the College of Physicians and Surgeons applying pressure to doctors using insurance / lack of scientific knowledge in re-signing some of these licenses.
Well, I have seen the stuff put out by the Ontario College, and I've seen the stuff from the BC College, and it just blows me away what a backward position they take when they know that their own doctors are prescribing oxycodone and all these sorts of things on a daily basis. I just think I saw in the paper last week that they finally released the stats to show that the great majority of overdose deaths and so on are all prescribed drugs. And I got a doctor who's connected to the MCRCI clinic in Vancouver, brought together about 12 doctors at St. Paul's Hospital a short while ago, and I was permitted to come and chat with them, and it was fascinating because that is a huge part of what has to be done, is educating doctors. And many of them would be concerned about, oh well, all these people want more than 10 grams a day, and I've sort of left it, I've set my limit at 10 grams a day. And so you'd say to them, well, what's the lethal dose ratio for cannabis compared to, say, oxycodone? And they kind of look at you and you'd say, well, you'd have to consume a couple of tons of this stuff in maybe a half an hour or something. You fall asleep before anything will happen, and there aren't any known deaths. So, why are you so worried? And of course, they're only worried because of the perspective of the college or the perception of the college and so on. When in fact, the dosage is usually something that's worked out over time between a doctor and a patient by various visits of trying this much. And, it usually starts with a lower amount and works up to a higher amount as opposed to the other way around. But the only specific experience I've had directly is of a doctor who approved a patient and then notified that patient's psychiatrist, as was the proper thing to do under the regs, and the psychiatrist got all upset and said that he hadn't concurred. And so a complaint was made to the college about this progressive doctor. When I talked to the lawyers involved at the college, they thought it was just a very minor, silly thing, and they didn't really think much of it at all. So it was good to know that at least the people working in the disciplinary process, at least in BC, had that particular attitude. But we need to do a lot of work with the doctors. I mean, it's, under the new regs, they've expanded the definition of healthcare practitioner to include nurse practitioners. But unfortunately, they're still limited by whatever the doctors in the particular college say in the particular province. There's another little point I neglected to mention and then should have maybe told you, that under the new regs, you'll only be able to get your medicine from a licensed producer or a doctor or a pharmacist, but the doctor or pharmacist have to get it from the licensed producer. Which raises an interesting thing, because what's been going through my head anyway is that if all of the dispensaries, the current dispensaries and compassion clubs, if you've got a doctor or a nurse practitioner, depending upon which province and powers, or a pharmacist associated to your club, that may be one way to facilitate the transition to the clubs being accepted as the appropriate method of dispensing. Because, you know, particularly if it's the pharmacist that has simply got all kinds of people helping him dispense the product to the patient or the doctor. It'll be interesting to see what they say about that. I don't see, you know, as long as you try to make it as close to the existing model as possible, we're not going to have growers being able to go around and give the doctors samples. I don't think that they can hand out the way they do in the pharmaceutical industry, but who knows, it may come to that. Anybody else?
Oh, hi. I'm not sure if that's a question within the realm of your knowledge, but I'm a veterinary research scientist, and I'm developing products which are specifically for animals, and, well, for chronic pain in animals. And I'm wondering what the new regulations say about the possibility of veterinarians giving prescriptions and dispensing medicine for canines and felines.
I think, I'm trying to remember specifically, but I'm wondering if they even said that you couldn't, it wasn't for animals, or if there was an actual section which said no in terms of animals, which is pretty weird, because as a, if you're a veterinarian.
A business is blossoming at a hydroponic shop in BC. Sales have been smoking hot ever since 2 U.S. states legalized marijuana. The company, called Green Planet, carries everything anyone would need to grow plants, any kind of plants, indoors. In Colorado, it is now legal to have 6 marijuana plants in a secure area. A business is blossoming at a hydroponic shop in BC. Sales have been smoking hot ever since 2 U.S. states legalized marijuana. The company, called Green Planet, carries everything anyone would need to grow plants, any kind of plants, indoors. In Colorado, it is now legal to have 6 marijuana plants in a secure area.